It's Levi Brackman with Truth Jewish Wisdom for today. Thank you so much for joining. This is the Torah portion uncensored part of this podcast. But before I begin, if you like this podcast, please leave a review, like it wherever you listen to the podcast, whether it's on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else. That helps other people also find it. Now, the Torah portion at hand is Lech Lecha, which starts off on chapter 12, Perikut base of Bereshis, of Genesis, and it's all about Abraham. Abraham is not introduced to us very well by the text. Yes, the Midrash has a lot of backstory on Abraham, but the text itself doesn't give us a lot of information about who Abraham is and why God specifically likes Abraham so much. Contrast that to Noah, where it tells us that Noah motza chen b'einei Hashem, that Noah was found favor in the eyes of the Lord. It doesn't tell us that at all about Abraham. Abraham just seems to be part of this family. At the end of the Torah portion of Noach, gives us some background information on who he is and who his family was, but it doesn't tell us really about who he was as a person. And the first thing that we find out about Abraham and anything in any really significant way is that God is talking to Abraham. But he must have been a very special person if God chose to talk to him. Now, in general, this Torah portion is talking about Abraham and the many journeys that he had and the many appearances that he had from God. So he's constantly talking to God throughout this Torah portion. Interspersed throughout that are dramatic events in the life of Abraham. For example, him going down to Egypt because there was a famine in the land of Canaan, and his wife being kidnapped from him by the Pharaoh, and he anticipates that this might happen, and therefore he tells his wife, please tell them that you're my sister so they don't kill me. And this is in fact what happens. She tells them that she is his sister, not his wife, and Pharaoh takes her, and all hell breaks loose in the house of Pharaoh because God intervenes and makes sure that Pharaoh is afflicted with a lot of afflictions to ensure that he doesn't touch Sarah. Pharaoh realizes that this is Abraham's wife, and he gives her back to Abraham and tells them to, leave Egypt. But as part of Pharaoh taking Abraham's wife, because he thought that it was his sister, he gives Abraham a tremendous amount of gifts, etc. So that is one of the things that enriches Abraham. There's other stories and wars along the way where Abraham fights the kings and wins them, and in order to be able to return Lot, who is his nephew, who was captured by them. And in the end of the Torah portion, we have Sarah giving her maidservant Hagar to Abraham as a wife, and she gets pregnant. Sarah feels bad about that. All of a sudden, Hagar is feeling a little bit more emboldened, and Sarah doesn't like that, and he sends her away. There's an encounter with the angel of God in the desert, and she has a child, and that child is Ishmael. To jump forward, Abraham then has another appearance with God, and Abraham has another appearance from God, and God tells Abraham that he should circumcise all his descendants, and he should himself get circumcised. So he circumcises Ishmael, and he circumcises himself. And that is more or less the Torah portion. I want to delve into a few anomalies that I found in the text, which I found to be particularly interesting. First of all, how many times does Abraham journey or move? And we find that he journeys in chapter 14, verse 4. So Perik Yud Beis Pasuk Dalet, he journeys the first time at the behest of God. Then on chapter 12, verse 5, again, actually talks about that same journey twice. And the commentators point out one of the verses is redundant, and it's really interesting. Why does it say twice? The first time, if you look at verse 4 of chapter 12, Perik Yud Beis Pasuk Dalet, it says, V'yelach Avram kasher diber elav Hashem, and Abraham went just like God had spoke to him. V'yelach ito Lot, and Lot went with him. Lot, who was his nephew, went with him. And it says how old Abraham was. He was 75 years when he went out of Haran. And then in the next verse, it says again, almost the identical thing. It says, verse 5, Vayikach Avram es Sarai ishtoi v'es Lot ben Achiv v'es kol choshev asher choshev v'es nefesh asher b'charam v'yisor lechas asher Canaan v'yavoy arz Canaan. And Abraham took Sarai his wife and Lot his nephew and all of their belongings that they had acquired and the souls that were made in Haran, and they went out and they went to the land of Canaan, and they came into the land of Canaan. So it tells us twice. Once it says that he just went with Lot, and the other one says he went with everybody else, including his wife and all of their belongings. Really interesting. We have then again another time that he leaves Vayetak Misham, verse 8 of that chapter, verse 9 again, Vayisa Avram, and Abraham traveled. And then in verse 10, Vayired Avram Mitzrayim, he goes down to Egypt. And then in chapter 13, verse 1, Yud Gimel Pasuk Aleph, it says Vayal Avram Mitzrayim, and then Abraham went up from Egypt. Again, he's traveling. And then in verse 3, Pasuk Gimel of Perek Yud Gimel, it also has, again, he traveled again, Vayelech Lamasov, Minegev ad Beisel. So those are all the different travelings that we have. We have 7 travelings, 7 different times when Abraham is embarking, or the verses tell us that Abraham is embarking on a journey. Some of them are the opposite side of the same travel, so going down to Egypt, going up from Egypt. Some of them are the same travel itself, just mentioned twice, but it's fair to say that this is very much about traveling. And then it's very much about appearances of God. If you look again how many times God appears to Abraham, we find it in the first verse of chapter 12, so Pasuk Aleph, Perek Yud Beis, where it says, V'yom Hashem al Avram, God said to Abraham, Lech Lecha mi'artzecha, go out of your land, and from your birthplace, from your father's house. So again, that's the first time God appears to Abraham. Then we find again in that same chapter, Pasuk Zayin, so Perek Yud Beis, Pasuk Zayin, we have another one of Vayir Hashem al Avraham, Vayoma Lazarach etnes Aretz Hazois, that Abraham, God again appears to Abraham and he tells him that I'm going to give to your seed, to your offspring, this land. And then in Perek Yud Gimel, which is chapter 13, verse 14, there's another part of the Torah portion I didn't mention in the preamble, that Lot also had a lot of possessions, and he didn't wanted to make sure that they wouldn't get into fights, because already they were seeing that the two shepherds, the shepherds of Abraham and the shepherds of Lot, were starting to disagree. So they separated from each other. Lot went to Sodom, and that's where he got captured. So that's the bit I didn't mention. But that happened, and so after Lot left Abraham, God appears to him again. And then in chapter 15, verse 1, which is Perek Tesvav Pasuk Aleph, it says the Achet Varm Ela, after all these things, Hayidvar Hashem al Avram, the word of the Lord came to Abraham, B'machsen, is in a vision, and he introduced himself to Abraham. He says, Ani Hashem Asher Tisicha Ur Kasdim, I am the Lord that took you out of Ur Kasdim. This is when Abraham left Haran. That was Ur Kasdim. When he left Ur Kasdim, God is introducing himself as the God that took him out of Ur Kasdim. And then another time we find that God appears to Abraham is in chapter 17, Perek Yud Zayin, Pasuk Aleph, verse 1, where it says, Vayir Hashem al Avram, V'yom Ani kel Shaddai, Hisalech lefanai v'yei tamim. He says that I am the Lord, the God of Shaddai, the God Shaddai. Go in front of me and you should be whole. Again, we have God appearing to Abraham multiple times. In this week's Torah portion, we find 5 appearances by God to Abraham in this Torah portion. A couple of things that I'll point out here, which I find to be interesting, and that all the appearances are talking about the land. They're all talking about either leave the land or this land I'm going to give you. They all make reference to the fact that this is the land that I'm going to give to you. Now, it's not just about that. There are other things as well. There's 2 times where it mentions that his offspring are going to be innumerable. One, he says they're going to be as innumerable as the sand, and one is going to be as innumerable as the stars. So both ideas, and to express how many are going to come out of Abraham. But the main thing, it seems to be here, is that I, God, am going to give you and your descendants this land. That's what's going to happen. So it's a lot about talking about the land, and that seems an introduction to the peoplehood of the children of Abraham, specifically Isaac, as it mentions later on in the Torah portion that Isaac's going to be born, that this is the land I'm going to give you. So it's very much focused on the land. And the other thing which is interesting here is we find that there's a lot of traveling, as mentioned, by Abraham. Abraham is traveling a lot. And then finally, when he finishes his travels, it seems like he rests. So he goes through all these travels. And then when it comes to chapter 13, verse 12, so Perek Yud Gimel, Pasuk Yud Beis, it says, V'Avram Yashav. And then in verse 18, Pasuk Yud Ches, it says, and Abraham tented, and he came, and he settled in Eloni Mamre, that was in Hebron, and he built an altar to God there. So after all these travels, eventually he settles. So there's a lot of traveling, and then there's a settling. And along these travels, you find that Abraham is meeting God and having conversations with God along the way, building altars, going down to Egypt and up from Egypt, etc. The other thing which is really interesting, I find, is how God is introduced to Abraham. In the beginning, we find that God doesn't introduce himself at all to Abraham. He just talks to Abraham. And then at some point along the story, God introduces himself to Abraham, and he says, I am the Lord that took you out of Ur Kasdim. Or he says, I am Kel Shaddai, I am the God of Shaddai. So that is also interesting, that we find these two introductions to Abraham, and those introductions happen not in the very beginning when Abraham is introduced to God, when God speaks to him. It seems like, who is this God who's speaking to him? He doesn't introduce himself. Later on, he introduces himself and says, well, which God am I? Who am I? Which God? What did I do for you? So, and the idea of God taking Abraham out of Ur Kasdim, that isn't told us in the story. In the story, it tells us that God tells him to leave Haran, leave your birthplace, leave your father's house to go to the land which I will show you. It doesn't take him out. It doesn't seem like there's any kind of taking him out. But later on, he says, I am the God who took you out. It doesn't tell us the backstory of how he was taken out. It just tells us that he left. So there's something else going on there, which the text seems to be missing, that kind of backstory. The other thing here is that there's a second introduction. So there's one introduction which says, I am the Lord, the God that took you out of Ur Kasdim. And then there's the other one, I am Kel Shaddai. So why the second introduction? What's the difference between the first introduction and the second introduction? That kind of is a question which shouts out from the text. So 3 questions here. Number 1, why not the introduction in the very beginning? Second of all, when after multiple appearances of God to Abraham, now he feels the need to introduce himself. And he introduces himself twice, one as the Lord that took him out of Ur Kasdim and one as Kel Shaddai. So why these number of introductions? And then the other thing which I found really interesting in this Torah portion is Abraham's wealth. So how does Abraham get his wealth? So it seems like in the beginning, there's 2 verses. One verse which seems like God told him to leave Haran, go out of your father's land. And the first verse says he left. And how did he leave? He left with Lot, with his nephew. And then the immediate next verse repeats itself, as I mentioned, straight away again. And it says he left, and he left with all his rechush, with all his possessions. It doesn't tell us necessarily that he had a huge amount of possessions, but he left with all his possessions and with Sarah, his wife, and with the Nefesh Hashasu B'Haran, all the people that he made in Haran. Doesn't really explain what that means, but there are 2 times that he's leaving there. And one time it seems that he's leaving just him and Lot, and the second time it seems like he's leaving with all his property and all his people, etc., etc. But it doesn't indicate necessarily that Abraham is very wealthy. Where does he get his wealth from? Well, there's only one time where it tells us that he gets wealth. Actually, there's 2 times, but one which he actually takes that wealth for himself. The other time he doesn't take the wealth for himself. So when he fights with the kings, he doesn't end up taking the wealth for himself. But when he goes down to Egypt and he tells Sarai, his wife, to tell them that she is his sister, not his wife, the Pharaoh gives him a tremendous amount of gifts for that. Now, it tells us the kind of gifts, which are the different kind of animals and those types of things. But when he goes up, he takes with him a lot of gold and silver. So in chapter 13, verse 2, it says, Avram kovid moed b'mikneh b'kesef v'zav. And Avram was very heavy. He was weighted down, if you like, with cattle and with gold and silver. But it doesn't tell us that Pharaoh gave him gold and silver. That doesn't tell us that. So where did he get all his gold and silver from? Somewhere in Egypt, although it doesn't tell us where he got it from. Pharaoh just gave him all this different cattle. To actually read the verse itself, it says, and what did the Pharaoh give to Abraham? He gave him, this is chapter 12, verse 16. That it says Abraham was made goodly for her. In other words, he was paid for Sarai. And he was given sheep and camel, and he was given donkey, he was given sheep. He was given sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, and camels. But it doesn't say anything about gold or silver. It's possible that in the middle, he sold a lot of this cattle and the female and male donkeys and also his camels, and he sold them for gold and silver. So now he had a lot of gold and silver. So that is possible. But it seems like his wealth was acquired from Pharaoh because he fooled Pharaoh, told Pharaoh this is his sister. Now, he was trying to save his life, so maybe he was in his rights to do that. But he didn't return all this wealth, which he got under false pretenses. So that I would just point out as well. Later on, though, Abraham tells the king of Sodom, who the king of Sodom wants to give him a lot of the spoils of the war, and he says, I won't take anything from you because I don't want anyone to say that I made Abraham become wealthy, which is really interesting. What does it mean? He became wealthy how? It seems from the text, from Pharaoh. And here he becomes wealthy in a legitimate way because he actually wins a war, and he doesn't want people to say that he became wealthy from Sodom, so he gives it all back. That seems to be an interesting thing that goes on here. So one of the things, after reading this very carefully, I find is that the story feels to be disjointed. The story doesn't feel like it all hangs together very simply and easily. There's different parts to the story, and there's a lot of repetition of God appearing to Abraham, telling him the same thing over and over again. It doesn't feel like this story really hangs together very easily. There's lots of different details all put together, and the text seems to be telling us something fundamental, and in the way it tells the story. And as I think about this, I have some just initial thoughts about perhaps what the text is trying to tell us. We have these various characters. We have Abraham, we have God, we have Sarai, we have Lot, we have the kings, and we have the Pharaoh. When we put all this together, it's really a very complicated and complex story. Abraham was interacting with all these different individuals, and all these different people had these different impacts on Abraham, on his life. God, as well as his wife, as well as Lot, as well as the kings. The story seems to be telling us that life is complicated and complex. It's all a journey. Eventually, you might get to a destination, but that destination is only part of a much longer journey. Yes, Abraham has all these journeys. God tells him to leave his parents' home and his homeland, and he moves to Canaan. And we think, well, that's amazing. God told you, move there. It's going to be amazing there because God told you to be there. But then as he gets there, there's a famine in the land, and he has to go down to Egypt. And that's seemingly not a good thing because it's famine. He has to move his whole family, etc. He's just got into the land of Canaan. But then he gets very wealthy there. But then he gets kicked out and he has to move again. It's a journey where things constantly move. And then as soon as he settles, he finds out that Lot, they're having fights amongst their shepherds. Lot has to move away, and now he's settled again. Lot's moved away. God appears to him. Again, something bad happens. Lot gets captured. He has to go and fight, etc. Then he realizes he doesn't have any children, and he has a child through Hagar, but that's not a good thing because that causes issues in his relationship with Sarai, with his wife. And then God tells him when he's very old that he's going to have a child and that he should circumcise himself. It is fraught. And there are all these details which seem not to hang together and things which contradict each other throughout. But Abraham is considered to be the greatest man, the founder of the Jewish religion, the person who we look up to and see his life as one which we should emulate. But it's a chaotic life, and a life which is full of contradictions, and a life, as I've pointed out multiple times here. On the one hand, he takes the money from Pharaoh, doesn't want to take it from stone. There's lots of contradictions here, lots of things which don't seem to make sense. God promises him one thing and another thing happens. The underlying story is trying to tell us that in the life of greatness can be a lot of chaos. And as there are things which bring us forward, there are also setbacks along the way. But those setbacks don't hold us back forever because it's all a journey taking us to a place, to the promised land to happen in the future. You're going to have descendants. The story doesn't stop with Abraham. It starts with Abraham. And God's telling him that this story is going to continue going on forward and forward. This land which I promised you, you might not be promised to you now, but it's going to be promised to your descendants. You might not have children now, but don't worry, you'll have a child, and that child will be one which will have kings growing out from him in the future. You are going to be the Av Hamon Goyim, the father of multiples of nations. It's a journey. And that journey is full of setbacks along the way. And I think that when you read the text in that way, then you start to understand who was this God who originally appeared to Abraham. It's unclear. Things are unclear in the beginning. Things then unfold and become clearer and clearer. Eventually God says, I am that God that took you out of Ur Kasdim. I am Kel Shakai. He explains, it becomes more clear as life progresses, as the journey continues, things become clearer and clearer. And so this, I think, trying to tell us something about the journey of life. There are setbacks to it. There are lots of different parts to the journey. There are times when we will feel settled, only to be uprooted again. But all of this is fine because it's all taking us in a direction which is going to be one of greatness. If we just follow that North Star and we have God in our life, I think the text is trying to tell us, then it is taking us further towards a destination, a promised land, which is glorious. This is the subtext of everything that's going on here. And when you read the text in this light, it starts to feel that it hangs together a little bit better. And maybe one can start to understand what the narrative underlying everything is trying to tell us. Again, this is a little bit of a chaotic Torah portion, but one of the most fundamental and basic building blocks of the Jewish people and of the reason why the land of Israel is so central to Jewish identity. This has been Levi Brackman, Truth Jewish Wisdom for today, Torah portion uncensored part of the podcast. Thank you so much for joining, and until next time.